Picture a Viking grave containing weapons, gaming pieces, horses, everything marking a high-ranking warrior. But DNA analysis reveals the skeleton is biologically female, igniting one of archaeology's fiercest debates. So, sit back, grab a cup of tea, and get ready to explore how Viking sagas describe fierce women warriors, while archaeology reveals weapons in female graves. We'll discover why the discovery of grave BJ581 ignited fierce debates about women's roles in Viking warfare, examine how evidence challenges our assumptions about gender in Norse society, and learn what legendary shield maidens, real Viking women's lives, and the complex truth between saga fantasy and archaeological reality tell us about one of history's most contentious questions. The term shield maiden conjures images of fierce women warriors fighting alongside Viking men, their swords gleaming, their battle cries echoing across medieval battlefields. Popular culture has embraced this image enthusiastically, from Wagner's Valkyries to Marvel's Lady Sif to the History Channel's Lathgertha. But behind these modern interpretations lies a complex historical puzzle. Do the legendary warrior women of Norse sagas reflect historical reality, literary fantasy, or something more nuanced between these extremes? For over a century, this question seemed largely settled. Victorian and early 20th century scholars viewing the past through their own gender assumptions dismissed saga accounts of women warriors as pure fantasy. The archaeological evidence seemed to support this view. Weapons in graves were assumed to indicate male burials, while jewellery and domestic items marked female ones. This neat binary classification shaped our understanding of Viking society for generations. Then came BJ581. In the 1870s, archaeologist Hjalmar Stolpe excavated a remarkable grave at Birka, Sweden's first major Viking Age trading centre. The grave, designated BA581, contained an impressive warrior burial: sword, axe, spear, arrows, 2 shields, 2 horses, and a full set of gaming pieces, suggesting strategic thinking. For over a century, this was cited as a textbook example of a high-ranking male warrior burial. No one questioned the occupant's sex. Why would they? The grave goods screamed warrior, and everyone knew warriors were men. But in 2017, everything changed. A team led by Charlotte Hedenstierna Jonsson published DNA analysis proving the skeleton in BJ581 was biologically female, chromosomally XX with no trace of Y. The announcement sent shockwaves through Viking studies. Here was scientific proof that at least one woman was buried with full warrior equipment in a major Viking Age trading centre. The implications were staggering, the debates explosive, and the questions profound. Critics immediately raised objections. Perhaps the bones were mixed up during excavation or storage. The research team provided detailed documentation showing continuous custody. Maybe she was buried with weapons for symbolic reasons. A warrior's widow, perhaps? But no male skeleton shared the grave. Could the weapons indicate status rather than occupation? Possibly, but the same logic would question every weapon burial. The gaming pieces, often associated with military command, added another layer of complexity. The BJ581 controversy forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about how modern assumptions shape archaeological interpretation. For decades, archaeologists sexed graves based on grave goods rather than skeletal analysis. Weapons meant male, jewellery meant female, a circular logic that reinforced preconceptions. When skeletal analysis contradicted artifact-based assumptions, the artifacts usually won. How many other warrior graves might contain female skeletons? How many assumptions need re-examination? But BJ581 is just one grave among thousands. To understand what it might mean, we need to examine the broader context of women in Viking Age society and warfare. This requires navigating between 2 extremes: those who see shield maidens everywhere, and those who deny any possibility of women warriors. The truth, as often happens, likely lies in the complex middle ground where exceptional individuals, specific circumstances, and regional variations create a more nuanced picture. Let's begin with the sagas, those remarkable medieval texts that preserve Norse traditions, histories, and legends. The sagas describe numerous women warriors, from mythological figures to purportedly historical individuals. These aren't passing mentions, but detailed narratives of women taking up weapons, leading forces, and dying in battle. The question is, what do these literary sources actually tell us about historical reality? Brynhild stands as perhaps the most famous saga warrior woman. In the Völsunga saga, she's a shield maiden who defied Odin, was punished with enchanted sleep, and could only be awakened by a hero brave enough to ride through flames. She teaches the hero Sigurd about warfare and wisdom. Later versions transform her into a Valkyrie, those supernatural women who choose the slain for Valhalla. But earlier traditions present her as human, skilled in warfare, tragic in love. The Brynhild story illustrates a crucial challenge in interpreting saga evidence. These texts were written centuries after the Viking Age, influenced by continental Romance literature and Christian scribes. How much reflects ancient tradition versus medieval literary invention? The supernatural elements are obvious fantasy, but what about the core concept of women skilled in warfare? The consistency across multiple independent traditions suggests something more than pure invention. Hervor presents a different model of the warrior woman. In Hervarar saga, she's born to adventure, disguising herself as a man to join Viking crews. She claims her cursed inheritance, the sword Tyrfing, by summoning her dead father from his burial mound. She leads raids, fights battles, and eventually settles down to raise a son who becomes king. Her story lacks Brynhild's supernatural elements, presenting a more human narrative of a woman choosing the warrior path. Saxo Grammaticus, writing his Gesta Danorum in the 12th century, describes several Danish women warriors. He tells of Lathgertha, possibly the inspiration for the TV character Lathgertha, who fought for Ragnar Lothbrok after escaping from a brothel. He describes 300 women fighting like men at the Battle of Brewer. His tone is disapproving. He considers women warriors unnatural, but he presents them as historical fact rather than myth. The saga of Friðis Eiríksdóttir offers another perspective. In the Vinland sagas, she doesn't lead warriors but shows remarkable battle courage. When Native Americans attack the Norse settlement, pregnant Friðis scares them off by baring her breast and slapping it with a sword. In another version, she orchestrates the murder of her rivals. Violent? Yes. Warrior? Debatable, but certainly not conforming to Victorian ideals of feminine behaviour. These literary sources share common themes. Warrior women often disguise themselves as men, suggesting social transgression. They frequently appear in liminal situations, voyages to new lands, succession crises, or supernatural encounters. Many stories end with the woman abandoning warfare for marriage and motherhood. The narratives acknowledge women warriors while reinforcing their exceptional nature. They're possible, but not normal, admirable, but problematic. But sagas aren't historical documents in the modern sense. They blend history, legend, and literary artistry. Written by Christian men centuries after the events they describe, they reflect medieval rather than Viking Age attitudes. The consistency of warrior women across multiple independent traditions suggests some historical basis, but extracting fact from fiction requires careful analysis and corroborating evidence. This brings us to archaeology, where physical evidence might support or contradict literary traditions. Weapons in female graves provide the most direct evidence, but interpreting this evidence proves surprisingly complex. The traditional assumption, weapons equal warrior, seems straightforward until we consider alternative explanations and cultural variations. Beyond BJ 581, numerous Viking Age female graves contain weapons. Norwegian archaeologist Anne Stalsberg identified over 40 female burials with weapons, though definitions and interpretations vary. These graves span the Viking world from Norway to Russia, suggesting widespread rather than localized phenomena. But what do these weapons mean? Are they functional warrior equipment, status symbols, religious offerings, or something else entirely? The types of weapons matter. Some female graves contain single arrowheads or small knives, hardly convincing warrior equipment. Others, like BJ 581, contain full weapon sets comparable to male warrior burials. The Oseberg ship burial included several weapons among its rich grave goods, though the two female occupants are usually interpreted as priestess and slave rather than warriors. Regional patterns emerged too. Weapon graves appear more common in Norway than Denmark, suggesting cultural variations in gender roles or burial practices. The chronological distribution offers intriguing patterns. Female weapon graves appear throughout the Viking Age, but seem to cluster in the 10th century. This coincides with increasing political centralization and military organization. Perhaps changing warfare styles created new roles for women, or maybe rising social tensions led to more women taking up arms in defense. The evidence permits multiple interpretations, but archaeology involves more than counting weapons in graves. Understanding Viking women's lives requires examining the full spectrum of their roles and rights. The popular image of Viking society as brutally patriarchal needs significant revision. Viking women enjoyed legal rights and social freedoms unusual for medieval Europe. Understanding this broader context helps frame the warrior woman question. Viking women could own land, run households, and conduct business. The keys hanging from their brooches weren't mere decoration, but symbols of authority over domestic spaces and resources. In a society where households were economic units and power bases, this authority carried real weight. Women managed estates when men went raiding, trading, or died. They could divorce unsatisfactory husbands and reclaim their dowries. They served as priestesses and völva, seeresses, wielding religious authority. The textile industry, dominated by women, formed a crucial economic sector. Viking Age textiles weren't just clothing, but currency, trade goods, and artistic expression. The women who produced these textiles controlled significant economic resources. Silk fragments in graves show women participating in long-distance trade networks. Some archaeologists argue textile production generated wealth comparable to raiding. Legal texts reveal women's formal rights. They could inherit property, though usually less than male relatives. They could serve as witnesses in legal proceedings. They received compensation for injuries, including sexual assault, notable in a medieval context. While not equal to men legally, Viking women weren't property either. They were legal persons with recognized rights and protections. Women also engaged in religious and magical practices. The völva commanded respect and fear, travelling between communities to perform Saga, Norse magic. Archaeological evidence, staffs, unusual burial positions, ritual objects, identifies probable seeress graves. These women operated outside normal social structures, gaining power through spiritual rather than martial means. The boundary between Valkyrie choosing the slain and völva predicting death might be thinner than we assume. This context of relative female autonomy makes warrior women more plausible. A society that allowed women to own property, run businesses, and practice magic might also allow exceptional women to take up arms. But allowed doesn't mean encouraged or common. Understanding Viking warfare's physical realities helps calibrate expectations. Viking Age warfare was brutally physical. The shield wall, the basic battlefield formation, required warriors to stand shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping, pushing against enemy lines while stabbing with spears or swords. This demanded significant upper body strength and endurance. Hand-to-hand combat with sword or axe required even more strength. While technique matters more than raw power, physical disparities between average men and women would be pronounced in such warfare. But Viking warfare wasn't limited to pitched battles between shield walls. Raids often involved quick strikes against unprepared targets. Shipboard fighting rewarded agility over pure strength. Archery allowed killing from distance. Defending settlements when warriors were away might fall to whoever remained. In these contexts, women's participation seems more feasible. A woman defending her farm against raiders faces different challenges than joining a planned military campaign. The concept of emergency mobilization appears in several sources. When threatened, communities mustered everyone capable of fighting. Legal texts mention women taking up weapons in defense. The Russian Primary Chronicle describes Slavic women fighting against Viking attackers. These defensive scenarios differ from offensive warfare, but still involve women in combat. The distinction between warrior as profession and fighting in extremis matters for interpretation. Some scholars propose women served in specialized military roles. Archers required less physical strength than melee fighters. Scout and intelligence work rewarded different skills. Medical support, treating wounded, managing supplies, kept forces functional. While not frontline combat, these roles operated within military contexts. The gaming pieces in BJ 581 might indicate strategic planning rather than direct combat leadership. The bodyguard hypothesis offers another possibility. Powerful women, queens, priestesses, wealthy merchants, needed protection. Female bodyguards could access women's quarters and accompany their charges everywhere. Byzantine sources describe Empress Theodora's female guards. Islamic sources mention Viking women among the Rus. Perhaps some weapon burials represent these protective specialists rather than general warriors. But we must be honest about the evidence's limitations. Even if we accept every female weapon burial as a warrior, they represent a tiny fraction of Viking Age burials. If shield maidens existed, they were exceptional. The sagas acknowledge this exceptionality. Their warrior women are remarkable precisely because they're unusual. Finding balance between dismissing all evidence and seeing shield maidens everywhere requires careful judgment. The scholarly debate over Viking warrior women reflects larger issues in archaeology and history. How do we interpret ambiguous evidence? How do modern assumptions shape our reading of the past? The BJ 581 controversy exposed fault lines between different archaeological approaches and political perspectives. Feminist scholars argue traditional archaeology systematically minimized women's roles, creating circular arguments that reinforced patriarchal assumptions. They point to assumptions about grave goods, the dismissal of saga evidence, and resistance to reinterpreting ambiguous cases. For them, BJ 581 validates long-standing critiques of archaeological sexism. If one unquestioned male warrior burial contained a woman, how many others might too? Traditional scholars counter that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. They worry about political agendas overriding scientific objectivity. One female weapon burial doesn't prove widespread warrior women any more than one male textile worker proves widespread male weavers. They emphasize statistical patterns. The overwhelming majority of weapon burials contain male skeletons where sex can be determined. Exceptions don't negate rules. Both positions have merit and weaknesses. Traditional archaeology did make unexamined assumptions about gender, but correcting past biases shouldn't mean embracing opposite biases. Feminist critiques exposed real problems in archaeological interpretation, but political conviction can't replace evidence. The heated rhetoric sometimes obscures how much common ground exists. Most scholars accept that some Viking women sometimes fought while disagreeing about frequency and context. The DNA revolution promises more clarity but also new complications. As more graves undergo genetic analysis, we'll likely find more surprises. But DNA reveals biological sex, not gender identity or social roles. A chromosomally female skeleton with weapons might be a warrior woman, a transgender man, or someone buried with weapons for entirely different reasons. Science provides new evidence but doesn't eliminate interpretive challenges. Comparative evidence from other cultures offers useful perspectives. Warrior women appear across cultures and centuries. Scythian horse archers, Dahomey Amazons, Soviet female soldiers. But each culture's specific context matters. What works on Central Asian steppes might not transfer to Scandinavian fjords. Still, cross-cultural patterns suggest conditions favoring women warriors. Demographic pressures, military innovations that reduce strength requirements, and social systems allowing female autonomy. The reception history, how different eras interpreted Viking warrior women, reveals as much about us as about Vikings. Medieval Christians disapproved, but didn't deny their existence. Renaissance writers romanticized them. Victorian scholars dismissed them as impossible. Nazi propaganda celebrated them as Nordic ideals. Modern feminists reclaim them as empowering symbols. Each generation reads its own concerns into the ambiguous evidence. Popular culture's embrace of shield maidens creates its own challenges. Television shows and video games need dramatic characters more than historical accuracy. The powerful image of Viking warrior women fighting equally alongside men appeals to modern sensibilities, but may distort historical understanding. When fiction becomes more familiar than historical evidence, separating entertainment from education becomes crucial. Museum presentations struggle with these challenges. How do you display BJ 581 without oversimplifying? How do you discuss possibilities without stating certainties? Some museums embrace the warrior woman interpretation to attract visitors and challenge stereotypes. Others maintain cautious ambiguity. The best presentations acknowledge debates and invite visitors to consider evidence themselves, rather than providing simple answers. The impact on modern Viking reenactment communities proves particularly interesting. Female reenactors wanting to portray warriors face criticism for historical inaccuracy and support for gender inclusion. Debates over women in combat activities mirror historical debates. Some groups maintain strict gender roles based on statistical patterns. Others allow individual choice based on exceptional examples. These modern negotiations reflect historical possibilities. Perhaps Viking communities had similar discussions. So where does this leave us? What can we say with confidence about Viking warrior women? First, that the question itself is more complex than simple yes or no answers allow. The evidence, literary, archaeological and comparative, suggests that some Viking women sometimes took up weapons and fought. But this statement requires careful parsing. Some means exceptional individuals, not common practice. These women appear remarkable in their own time, not routine. Sometimes means specific circumstances, defending homes, accompanying expeditions, serving powerful women, facing emergencies. Career shield maidens forming significant military units remain unproven. Took up weapons and fought covers a spectrum from last-ditch defense to planned military action, from single combats to battlefield participation. The BJ 581 burial suggests at least one woman achieved high military status, buried with honours matching male warriors. Whether she personally fought, commanded forces, or held ceremonial rank remains unknown, but her burial demonstrates that Viking-age people could conceive of women in military roles. The grave goods made sense to those who buried her. The sagas preserve traditions of warrior women that, while literarily embellished, likely reflect some historical reality. The consistency across multiple sources, the matter-of-fact presentations, and the acknowledgement of exceptionality suggest memories of real women who transcended normal gender boundaries. Strip away supernatural elements and literary conventions, and plausible cause remain. The broader archaeological pattern of weapons in female graves, while individually ambiguous, collectively suggests women's relationships with weapons weren't absolutely prohibited. Whether functional or symbolic, offensive or defensive, common or rare, these graves complicate simple gender binaries. Viking Age reality was messier than neat categories suggest. Understanding Viking women's general autonomy and authority makes warrior women more plausible without making them common. A society with female landowners, traders, and priestesses might also produce female fighters. But possibility doesn't equal probability. Most Viking women, like most Viking men, never saw battle. Those who did remained exceptional. Modern debates about Viking warrior women reflect contemporary concerns about gender, power, and history, but they also represent genuine scholarly attempts to better understand the past. As evidence accumulates and methods improve, our understanding evolves. Future discoveries will likely complicate the picture further, rather than providing simple answers. What lessons can we draw from this complex evidence? First, that human societies are more variable and flexible than rigid categories suggest. Second, that exceptional individuals throughout history have transcended social limitations. Third, that evidence requires careful interpretation, free from both traditional and revisionist biases. Fourth, that the past was different from but not inferior to the present. Vikings navigated gender in their own context, not ours. The figure of the Viking warrior woman, whether BJ 581's unnamed occupant, saga heroes like Brynhild, or anonymous women defending their homes, challenges us to think more carefully about the past, not to project modern wishes onto medieval people, but to recognize their full humanity, including their capacity to surprise us. As you finish your tea and reflect on this journey through saga and archaeology, consider how future generations might judge our gender assumptions. What evidence will we leave? What debates will rage over interpreting our remains? The Viking warrior women, real or literary, remind us that human experience has always been more diverse than simple categories allow. The shield wall has fallen, the battle horns are silent, and the longships have rotted away. But questions about who could stand in that shield wall, blow those horns, and sail those ships remain vibrantly alive. In wrestling with Viking warrior women, we wrestle with fundamental questions about human possibility and limitation, about how societies construct gender, and how individuals transcend those constructions. Perhaps that's the ultimate gift of the shield maidens, historical or mythical. They force us to question assumptions, examine evidence carefully, and remain open to complexity. Whether common or rare, real or imagined, they've won their strangest victory, conquering academic conferences and internet forums 1,000 years after their world ended. In that sense, at least, the warrior women have achieved a form of immortality that any Viking would envy. The evidence will never be complete enough to satisfy everyone. New discoveries will fuel new debates. But that's the nature of studying the past. We see through a glass darkly, interpreting fragments and shadows. The Viking warrior women remind us that those shadows sometimes take unexpected shapes, that the past was stranger and more varied than we imagine, and perhaps, in the end, that's enough.